Okay, we're live. Paul Van Wagner, Mike McDaniel, the voice of college football. Shout out to Mark for allowing us to steal his space once again to talk all things Hokies. How you doing, man? How's your January? How's your 2022 so far, Mikey?
First week was a little rough. Didn't have power for most of it, so that was a problem. But doing all right now.
Yeah. You kind of have a big announcement. Have you made that announcement on this platform? As far as the two becoming three.
Oh yeah, my wife and I are expecting.
Yeah. How about that? Man? And we were confident that was never going to happen. We had bets on you not being able to make that happen, but yet here you are. Congratulations, man. That's fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, we're excited. Yeah, gonna have a boy.
Oh, all right. Now, have you picked out names?
Noah William.
Okay.
William, after my dad. Noah
okay.
William.
I like it. So there's no chance, like, if I start a GoFundMe and start a college fund for him and like put like $10,000 in it, that you would let me pick the name. Like, you guys are set on this?
I think Brian Kelly said it best, like a week before he left Notre Dame, when they asked him if he would ever leave Notre Dame. He said, if the fairy godmother, waves a $250 million check, I'd have to run it by my wife first. So I don't want to, never say never.
I feel like there is a 0% chance that Kate is going to give me an opportunity to name your child.
Probably 0, but I'm willing to bet she would take the money, though.
No way, man. It's a package deal. There's no way that's happening. All right. So Justin Fuente. Wow. Stuck in the past. Brent Pry. Let's try that again. Brent Pry addressed the media today. First time since his inaugural press conference where he kind of just outlined a lot of real generalities. This time a little bit more specific. We now know who the whole coaching staff is. Overall, I feel like at the inaugural press conference we were all at like a 10.
Yeah.
Where are we now? Are we still up at the 10? Have we tempered this a little bit?
I'm still pretty high on it. How about you?
He's saying all the right things.
Yeah.
The difference though. So Fuente said all the right things 6 years ago. The difference though is Pry is doing the things that you follow up saying the right things too, right?
Already.
Yeah.
And I mean, and it's, you got to be kind of cautious too, right? Because, when Pry took over, he had about a week until the early signing period.
Yep.
And so he had really just a week to recruit, and he only had a couple of guys on staff at that point in time. And Paul, you actually asked a question during the press conference today regarding, the state of Virginia and high school coaches and how they've received Brent Pry's staff. And he was pretty honest with his assessment and said, look, like, I think they like the guys that we've introduced them to, but during the early signing period, we only had a few guys on the staff actually out there recruiting because we didn't have enough of them officially hired yet. And I think now that you have the full staff in place and you hear his plan, it's really easy to say in the introductory press conference, a couple months back, yeah, hey, look, I'm going to recruit Virginia. It's a different thing to go out right there before the early signing period and immediately hit the ground running all over the state, which is what he did. And for him to come out today and say, okay, when the recruiting dead period ends this Friday, tomorrow, we are going to spend the entirety of the first week recruiting the state of Virginia.
Yep.
He said, with the exception of like one night, they had a commitment out of state. I think he and a few coaches had a commitment out of state. But he said, outside of that, they're going to be in the state of Virginia the entire first week. Now, Virginia Tech does hold their junior day here coming up, and that'll be significant. So, there's going to be a number of players on campus this weekend, several of them in-state targets. But Brent Pry and his staff are not only going to have those kids, in the building and on campus when the dead period ends this weekend, but he's also going to make sure he and his staff are on the road recruiting in the state of Virginia. So, again, one thing to say it in the introductory press conference is another thing to do it with your first two early opportunities, when they present themselves to go out there and really try to hit the state hard in terms of recruiting, which is something he's clearly trying to do.
So I'm gonna take everyone back in time a little ways, right? And not to harp on or belittle the Justin Fuente era at Virginia Tech, but I think to put it in perspective for people so that they understand kind of where I'm coming from when I ask these questions of Brent Pry. 6-ish years ago, maybe a little bit less than 6 years ago, Brent Justin Fuente said to us in the media, when I walk into a school in Virginia with Bud Foster next to me, I have instant credibility.
Right.
And I thought to myself, okay, all right, I get it, but at some point in time, you got to build your own credibility. Fast forward to about 2 years ago. I asked Justin Fuente this same question. I said to him, I said, do you remember saying that to us? He said, yeah, I remember saying that to you. And I said to him, I said, and this was right after Bud announced that he was going to retire. So it was kind of poignant because he couldn't hide behind Bud Foster anymore, right? I said to him, I said, do you feel like you've done enough to have your own credibility in the Commonwealth of Virginia? And he grabbed his bottle of water, he took a drink of it, and he looked me dead in the eye and he said, I don't know. And he took the next question. And I was so shocked by that response, Mike, that I was just like, I didn't have a follow-up question. Right? Like,
right.
I was like, holy crap, you don't know?
And I think that's why we saw the issues that we saw with Justin Fuente's staff in terms of recruiting, specifically in the state of Virginia. And Brent Pry said today, it's kind of a shot across the bow at Justin Fuente and his staff, but he did mention today, he said, we are not going to recruit west of the Mississippi unless there is an existing tie to Virginia Tech with a player or a player's family. That's the only time we're going to be doing that. He mentioned specifically, we don't feel like there's a need to go into Texas. We don't feel like there's a need to go into like Nebraska. He started throwing states out there where Virginia Tech has tried to recruit before. And he said, we don't feel like there's a need to do that unless there's an existing relationship. So, a player's family, a father, a high school coach, somebody better be affiliated with Virginia Tech in the past in order for us to go pursue that kid. Otherwise, it's a waste of time. He did mention that he didn't want to throw darts, right? He's like, we're not just going to throw darts out there and see what sticks. We're going to recruit within a 6-hour radius of Blacksburg. The area that he did mention that Virginia Tech has had some success in the past, had success here and there under Justin Fuente, but James Franklin and Brent Pry, for that matter, did a pretty good job locking down the state of Pennsylvania. Specifically Western PA, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania area, where Brent Pry has had a ton of success. And, Pry has been had been one of James Franklin's top recruiters. And his recruiting area was that Western PA area around Pittsburgh and Harrisburg. And he did mention that was going to be a priority for him to recruit that area of Pennsylvania. And he answered that specifically when asked, okay, outside of Virginia, what is the footprint? Right. And he said Eastern Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, the DMV. And then he mentioned specifically Western PA, Philadelphia. And he said, if you get into Philly, you're not too far from Jersey. And for those of you watching this that live in Philly or have lived in Philly in the past or around Philadelphia, you know how close Philadelphia is to Jersey, right? And how close those connections are. So, I mean, it's clear that they have a plan from a recruiting standpoint, which is refreshing and sounds silly because you always have to have a plan from a recruiting standpoint in college football. But it seemed like Justin Fuente's staff, for the large part of their tenure, lacked that identity. They had it early in the tenure, right? You remember the North Carolina and the state of Virginia were two areas that were very good to Virginia Tech. Some of Virginia Tech's best players over the last few years have come from Virginia or North Carolina. You'd think that they would have recruited those two states harder. One of them being Virginia in state, the other being the neighboring state of North Carolina. It's almost like when Mac Brown showed up, Fuente and his staff stopped recruiting North Carolina as consistently as they had in the past. That really hurt them, and they lacked identity the last few years of the tenure. That was a big issue. That
is actually a great point. Like the Mac Brown thing, and like that, I don't I don't get that. Why you let Mac Brown run you out of North Carolina the way they did?
Yeah.
It's very weird. It'll be interesting to see because honestly, I mean, you're closer to Charlotte here in Blacksburg and
Right.
Christiansburg than you are to the 757, the Virginia Beach area, Norfolk. So it will be interesting to see, and that does fit in that 6-hour radius from Blacksburg that Brent Pry mentioned,
Yep.
how hard they continue to recruit that area of North Carolina. I like everything that he said so far. I think he's done the things that and said the things that we as fans of Virginia Tech want and need to hear. And it does feel like not only is he saying those things, but he's also he's doing, right? The action speaking as loud as the words. So I feel like that's a huge positive, in my opinion, for what Brent Pry is currently doing versus what the former regime did for the Hokies.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And the one thing too is he didn't mention this state specifically, but I think the state of Florida is going to be pretty important to Virginia Tech. I know that's not within a 6-hour radius of Blacksburg, but I think that'll be one of the states where there will be an exception. I do know that Virginia Tech has some former players who coach in the state of Florida in the high school ranks. Antonio Banks at IMG is one that comes to
Right.
mind. And obviously you want to recruit those players from IMG Academy. So I do think Florida, while maybe not like the priority, will be one of those states that outside of the 6-hour radius of Blacksburg will likely become important to Virginia Tech, given the depth of talent on the East Coast.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit different to recruit a kid from Florida to Virginia, rather than
Right.
Texas to Virginia. I think it makes a little bit more sense. And just knowing, Virginia Tech's had a lot of successful players in the history of the program come from the state of Florida. I do think that will be an area where Brent Pry and his staff will maybe not focus a ton of their time, but will definitely focus some of their time outside of the 6-hour driving radius of Blacksburg.
Yeah. Wayne asks what we give the recruiting as far as a grade is concerned. Giving recruiting a grade is so hard because right now, I mean, let's give them a solid B plus, right? But 3 years from now, that B plus could be an A, depending on how the talent is developed. That B plus could be a D minus, depending on how the talent isn't developed.
Right. I mean, I think what we can do right now pretty easily is give him a grade on the effort, right? Mm-hmm. Keeping kids in the class, when he had basically 10 days to do it, with no staff assembled. He had Derek Jones and Sean Quinn and himself, and that was pretty much it, right? I mean, he was I know he was retaining Pearson Prelo, but that hadn't been officially announced yet. So what we can grade him on is effort. And all we've seen so far is him hitting the ground running. They're posting pictures all over social media of them on private planes and flying all over the state, flying over to Newport News in the 757 area, Virginia Beach, flying to Northern Virginia, meeting with kids who were a high priority for the 2022 class that, a lot of them did end up signing on National Signing Day. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, all we can grade him on at this point is effort. Now, get back to me in a week, right? I'll have a better idea once we actually see the staff recruit a little bit here this spring, right? The dead period ends tomorrow. So there is now about a 5-week window where Virginia Tech can actively hit the recruiting trail before spring practice starts. Right. So let's see what this staff can do. This is their first real opportunity to recruit. This is their very first opportunity to recruit as a full staff. And this is their second opportunity to recruit with at least some of the staff, right? So let's see what they can do. Junior day is important, obviously hitting the ground running with the 2023 kids. And let's see what they're able to do in regard to, building those relationships, which is a big part of the press conference today, talking about how he wanted to establish relationships. It wasn't just going to be a handshake and leave type thing, which again, another indirect shot at the old staff, because a big complaint from some of the high schools in Virginia. We're going to use Highland Springs as an example, because Highland Springs in Richmond has been a recruiting pipeline in the past for Virginia Tech, but was not under Justin Fuente. Lauren Johnson, their head coach, former player at Virginia Tech, Brent Pry mentioned Highland Springs specifically in the press conference today and said this is not going to be a handshake and leave situation. Brent Pry's been out there recruiting. I understand it was only, about a week and a half, but he was out there recruiting the state of Virginia, and he knows what these high school coaches think of the old regime. They've told him, right? He wants to build those relationships, and he's made a point to say, bring in Mike Villagrana as his chief of staff in an off-the-field role and having him say, sit down with all these guys on the staff and say, who are your existing relationships with in the state of Virginia? Let's draw it out. Let's divide and conquer.
Right.
That you would have never heard that, regardless of what you think of the Justin Fuente tenure. I know most Virginia Tech fans are like, we want to wash our hands of that completely.
Yeah.
Regardless of what you think of the tenure as a whole, we can all admit we would have never heard that coming from Justin Fuente's staff. They would have never said, we're dividing and conquering, we're going here, we're going there. Who are your relationships with? We never saw that. And that's why Virginia Tech's relationships with schools in Virginia were so strained during that time.
Yeah. Well, and I've had former players say to me, what do a bunch of cowboys from Oklahoma and Texas know about talking to surfer kids from the beach, right? And you don't think about it until it's presented to you in that way that, oh man, there is a serious disconnect, right? Like, I mean, and it's nothing like, it's not a bad thing, but you've got guys from Oklahoma and Texas trying to recruit kids that want to spend their day on the beach. Like, just wow. Like, when you look at it from that vantage point, it's like, okay, maybe this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And then the unwillingness, the other thing that I always heard, Mike, was the unwillingness to change. The quote of, they would rather be right than win, has been said to me in some variation so many times. And it feels like this new regime wants to win, will admit when they're wrong. Hey, we screwed this up. We're gonna fix it. We're gonna make it right. We're gonna learn from our mistakes, right? And we're gonna move forward as a collective, as Hokie Nation. So I'm definitely looking forward to seeing what can happen here. The big question, and maybe you know this, maybe you don't. Maybe this is something that we bring up on the drive on ESPN Blacksburg Monday through Friday from 4 to 6. By the way, you can stream it on the ESPN Blacksburg app. We talked to guys like Evan Watkins from VT Scoop and Tim Sullivan from Rivals about this. Is what is the whole of Virginia Tech's roster look like right now? How many guys can they actually add? Because that does play a big factor. I mean, kudos to Brent Pry and his staff for keeping those 22, 23 kids that they kept committed to Virginia Tech. But with COVID, with the extra year, with guys getting, Johnny Jordan just announced that he got a 6th year, so he's coming back, which is a good thing. Like, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. Yeah, it's a huge thing for Virginia Tech. But so what does this roster look like now? How many guys can they actually still add? Because, you don't want to get too far down into the weeds and go, oh yeah, they had a great recruiting up until December, but now there's nothing for that February. There may not be space for anyone in February.
Yeah. And he did mention in the press conference today, he's waiting on decisions from defensive back Shamari Connor, long snapper, Oscar Shadley, defensive back Nadir Thompson, some of the guys who went through senior day but haven't officially announced what they're doing one way or another, guys who are probably likely not to be drafted, right? Or I guess in Shamari Connor's case, maybe a late round pick, or maybe gets a free agent opportunity. So I think regardless of whether or not they actually know, right, Brent Pry and his staff, I'm sure they have an inkling one way or another. Maybe some of these players are waiting to announce it. Maybe they're still contemplating it, but I'm sure Brent Pry and his staff have a general idea if these guys are going to come back or not. And it does impact some things, right? Like the transfer portal specifically, because everything is so jacked up from a roster management standpoint to begin with COVID, right? There's so many people in the transfer portal and there's only so many spots, because with players being able to take an extra year of eligibility from the 2020 season that didn't count for anybody from a requirement standpoint in regards to eligibility, there are now guys who are in college 6 or 7 years, given that one random year we had. And, yeah, I mean, Brent Pry and staff that's something they need to manage, right? And roster management was an issue under Justin Fuente, but not from a sheer numbers standpoint. It would be like numbers at certain positions, right? Where Virginia Tech has about 1,000 running backs, right? And it was like, man, why don't we have any quarterbacks? Why do we have 40 running backs and no quarterbacks on the roster now? Like, what's going on with that? And so Brent Pry needs to navigate the roster mismanagement of the prior regime while also balancing who's coming back and who's not, navigating a transfer portal, trying to address the areas of need for those positions that, don't have the players or don't have the depth that you would like to see or he would expect coming in. So the one thing that stood out to me also, Paul, from the press conference today was that he mentioned that he sees the transfer portal as something that he's going to have to run in parallel with high school recruiting. And he said, high school recruiting, he said, that is our emphasis, right? And that's really important. But he said, there are situations with our roster where we are going to have to address an immediate need through the transfer portal, and we're not going to have situations like you've seen this, some places in college football, they almost just bring in too many transfer portal guys. Hell, you saw that at Virginia Tech at times, right? Where there's too much of a priority put on the transfer portal, not enough on high school recruiting. And Brent Pry said, no, that's not what I'm saying. We're going to be, recruiting is going to be our bread and butter, but the transfer portal needs to be run in parallel because there are situations where, especially early on, where immediate needs have to be met through the portal. And that's how that's the way Virginia Tech's going to have to handle things.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. That's for sure. As far as the coaching staff is concerned, there were a lot of eyebrows that got raised when Rudolph was announced as the offensive line coach and run game coordinator, simply because, it felt like, and Brent Pry addressed this, it felt like a lateral move from Wisconsin to Virginia Tech. But Brent said, look, he didn't see it as a lateral move because he saw it as an opportunity to become more involved with the run game. And look, man, this is a guy, for all of the misgivings of the Justin Fuente regime, I feel like the offensive line was the one place where we could look and say, this is kind of the A+ group year in and year out, right? And I feel like that's a testament to the O-line coaching. Now you bring in a guy like Rudolph, and it feels like it's gonna go from a 9.9 to an 11 as far as that is concerned. So I'm very excited about the offensive line to see kind of how this plays out, and the whole offense. We might actually get to see running the ball control, quarterback under center, Mike. What? Come on.
It's going to be a Big Ten offense through and through. And it's going to be, we're going to lean on our defense and we're going to run the ball right down your throat. And it's going to be very old school, I think. The Virginia Tech offense is going to be run. But, Tyler Bowen also knows how to spread out defenses and, make them defend the entire field, because we've seen him, while he hasn't had extensive play calling experience, when he has called plays, most notably in the Cotton Bowl that Penn State played in a few years ago, where they put up 50 points, whatever it was, 600 or 700 yards of offense. And, he had really successful offenses at Fordham in the FCS, where he was the offensive coordinator and the play caller. And his offenses do a little bit of everything. And I'm sure that Brent Pry is going to want to ensure that his teams run the football well. But it says a lot when you get a guy like Tyler Bowen who has Power 5 offensive coordinator, or at least co-OC experience. And, he's been a major, if you don't consider co-OC a major coordinator, consider him a major assistant coach on his staff, right? At Penn State's caliber in the Big Ten. He has NFL experience being the Jaguars tight ends coach, and we know he's a tireless recruiter. And the fact that Brent Pry came out and said, he was my first choice, just said flat out, like he was one of the first guys I called. And, a lot of people were wondering why, if he was, the first guy you called as the offensive coordinator, why wasn't the hire announced until this week? And he said he had some conversations, Brent Pry did, with the Jacksonville Jaguars GM, Chris Ballard. He was like, okay, I need you to let me hire Tyler Bowen. He said, no. Like, Tyler Bowen, he needs to stay here and fulfill his duties, but I will allow you to, have him, do some things. Right. So it was clear Brent Pry was appreciative of that. He just said, they had to work around some things because he wasn't officially announced as the head coach.
And you talk, we pounded on the recruiting of Virginia, and we neglected to mention Fontel Mines, the wide receivers coach for Virginia Tech, the most recent addition to this group. I mean, you talk about a guy that's recruited Virginia, right? Richmond, James Madison, ODU. I mean, he is solely recruited Virginia. If anyone has an established relationship with a high school in Virginia, Fontel is going to be that guy, and I think that's huge. I kept asking the recruiting guys, like, there's got to be somebody, right? There's got to be a former Hokie. There's got to, and they kept saying that there's nobody that would fit that wide receiver coach's role that is a former Hokie that can recruit. No, they Brent Pry found him in Fontel Mines, and man, I'll tell you what, a UVA guy though, Mike. You're a Hokie alum. How you feeling about that? There's been a couple of UVA guys that have jumped ship, if you will.
Fine with me as long as they can coach. Totally fine with me. Fontel Mines is an interesting hire too. Being a Virginia guy, he's got the relationships in the state. He checked off a lot of boxes for Brent Pry, and I think the hire makes sense in the context of the relationships that Mines has built in Virginia and what Ricky Ronnie thinks of him, right? The ODU head coach. It was pretty funny because Brent Pry mentioned at the coaching convention this past week in San Antonio, he was sitting at a table with James Franklin and Marshall head coach Charles Huff, and he was sitting there with ODU coach Ricky Ronnie, and they were like, "Hey man, you can sit here, but don't steal any more of our guys." Of course,
yeah, right.
Virginia Tech is stealing the strength and conditioning coach from Penn State in Dwight Galt. They're stealing Mike Villagrana, the chief of staff in an off-field role. They're stealing, Mines from ODU, of course. So, and it was interesting because Pry did say today, he said, it is always easier when you have a guy that you're interested in from a staff that you're familiar with and a head coach that you trust. He said it's always easier in the process to get a good feel when the head coach is going to give an honest evaluation. And he thinks very highly of all those guys I just mentioned from a head coaching standpoint. He said he was given honest evaluations, and all these guys want their assistants to succeed, right? They want to build their coaching tree. And, for them to come to Virginia Tech and have the recommendations of those head coaches, I think, it gave Pry a comfort level for guys he might not have known as well.
Again, a big ding on the former staff was the lack of cohesion with the history of Virginia Tech, right? They did the Beamer 25 thing, which was cool and all of that. Yeah. But the previous players, the previous stars hadn't felt like there was a lot of love given to them. Fast forward to just the other day, actually 2 days ago, Xavier Adibi announced as one of the offensive, or one of the defensive staff members. And you talk about a guy like, so I spend a lot of time on Twitter, as do you. I was not here during Xavier's tenure at Virginia Tech, but I have yet to find anyone that says anything bad about him, right? Like, so you want to talk about bringing in a guy that's going to galvanize the history and the former players with this new regime. Xavier might be just the guy to do that, Mike.
Yeah, definitely. All conference player and a guy who has been coaching in the lower levels of college football. And, Brent Pry said that he's admired Xavier Adibi. He knew Xavier Adibi, And he said he's always admired him and, took an interest in him as a coach. But he said he didn't have a personal relationship with Xavier Adibi. So who did he call Brent Pry? Brent Pry called Bud Foster. He said, Bud,
makes sense.
Xavier Adibi. Yeah, good choice, right? You know Xavier Adibi as well as anybody. You coached him. You still have a really good relationship with him now that he's become a coach, right, in the college ranks. What do you think of Xavier Adibi? And he checked off a lot of boxes. Obviously, being a VT alum is significant, but from a coaching standpoint and a recruiting standpoint, checked off a lot of boxes for Brent Pry. He said that was all validated when he was able to finally build that relationship with Xavier Adibi and speak with him on the phone and meet him in person. He said that's when it really clicked with him that this guy was going to be a really good fit. So I mean, Pry is saying and doing all the right things. I think bringing a DB back into the program, he's a beloved member. We talked about J.C. Price and how fans feel about J.C. Price and how fans feel about Justin Hamilton, even though Hamilton's not on the staff anymore. It's a very similar parallel there, with a former player coming back, and Jack Tyler, right, from the old staff too, all conference linebacker for Virginia Tech. Bringing those types of guys into the program can only help.
Yeah, I agree. I think, again, back to the original statement that I made, it feels like all of the boxes are being checked, all of the right things are being said, and the follow-up is there too. Final thoughts before we wrap this up, Mikey. I asked if there was a timeline for spring game. I think maybe I jumped the gun a little bit on that, but I was so excited, right? Like,
yeah,
the feeling of, what is this going to look like? And we know that, because Brent Pry said, right, okay, so just because we go through spring game and, it looks a certain way, there's going to be another round of guys that'll jump in the transfer portal, guys that Virginia Tech will recruit to come to Virginia Tech.
Right.
So by the time we kick this thing off early September, it may look a little bit different. But, like, just I don't think I'm going to the spring game as a member of the media. I think I want to sit in the stands at Lane Stadium as a fan of Virginia Tech football and see kind of what this looks like. And I got a feeling I'm not going to be alone. It might look a lot like spring of 2016 again for Hokie Nation come spring game.
It was pretty funny because they know when the spring game is going to be.
No, absolutely.
They know when spring practice is going to be. I mean, Brent Pry looks over at Virginia Tech Sports Information Director for Football, Pete Morris, and he goes, "Can I answer that?" And he's like, "No, not yet." It's like, okay, well, we have, and then Pry was honest about it too, right? He goes, "We have some dates in house. Like, we have an idea when it's going to be." He said 90% of the schedule. He said this outright. He said 90% of the spring schedule has been written down on paper. We just haven't announced it yet. So there's just this seems silly because it doesn't really matter. I think it does matter, but it also doesn't. There's just a genuineness and an honesty and an openness with Brent Pry that just wasn't present with Justin Fuente. Again, none of it matters unless you're winning football games. But I do think that you
know what? You're wrong. You're wrong. And I'll tell you why you're wrong. Because with the genuineness and the nicety of Brent Pry, it's going to give him more rope, right? Like, one of the biggest arguments about Justin Fuente was there's the whole, there's nothing to see here, right? There's nothing going on, right? Like, let's just keep everything closed up. And when you start to lose games, people start to kind of peel back the onion as much as they can. I think with Brent Pry, that does it matter if he wins games? No, it absolutely doesn't. If he starts to lose, though, there's going to be a little bit more leniency, I think, from Hokie Nation, because they understand that he is giving you the information that you're asking for.
Yeah, I mean, he's honest, he's open, he's genuine with it. I mean, he was asked about, what was one of the main traits you were looking for in your staff, and he said, I want them to be able to build personal relationships with people. And it's like, wow, what a concept. People skills. That's one of the key. He goes, all these guys, and he mentioned this, he said, all these guys I talked to, he said, a lot of them can really coach. And he said there are a lot of them that were a fit for Virginia Tech that I didn't pick to be on the staff. And he said there are a lot of friends of mine. This stood out to me. That's not being talked about really on social media at all in the last couple of hours. This really stood out to me, Paul, when he said, I had friends of mine that were interested, in the coaching ranks, friends of mine that were interested in coming to Virginia Tech that I had to turn down because they weren't good fits for the program. What did we say about Justin Fuente? We said that he won't part ways with his friends, right? Brad Nelson, former offensive coordinator, won't part ways with his friends. Brent Pry is already saying, I'm not forget parting ways with them. I'm not hiring them to begin with if they're not a fit. How about that for a breath of fresh air?
That's it. Exactly. All right. I'll let you get back to work. You must have something to do. So thanks to everyone who jumped on today and watched this. It'll be up on the podcast section of this. Again, if you want to check out what we got going on at ESPN Blacksburg Monday through Friday, it's The Drive. We have the ESPN Blacksburg app. Feel free to download it. It's free. We spend a lot of time on the Hokies. We also spend a lot of time on the ACC and everywhere else. You can follow me on Twitter at Paul V. Wags. Pretty simple. Mike is pretty much everywhere. If you can find a podcast that's related to Virginia Tech, there's a good chance Mike's on there. But Mikey, give the people the laundry list of Mike McDaniel.
At Mike McDaniel SOS on Twitter. That's where you find everywhere that I'm at. But sonsofsaturday.com, and check out Hokie Hangover Podcast, Basketball Conference Podcast. If you're an ACC football fan, that's an ACC football podcast. So go check that out as well.
Yeah, and if you want to, Wayne's right. If you want to beef with Mike, Twitter is the place to go. He tends to throw things out there every now and again that get him in trouble, and just sitting back and eating popcorn and watching it is fantastic. Take care of yourself, man.
I was just going to leave that right there.